We planned the slingshot like a surgeon plans an incision, precise angles, a hair's breadth of tolerance, and contingency plans people in offices called safety buffers that never feel like enough when you're strapped to the hull listening to metal sing. The idea was simple in mission control terms. Dive in low over the gas giant, use its gravity to catapult us across the system, save weeks of propellant, shave time off the return window. For us, on the Marauder, it was the difference between getting home on schedule and being a footnote in a debris field. We approached the pocket of space where the gravity well looked like a steep valley on the navigation map. Below us, the gas giant rolled in bands of color like an angry planet made of oil. The atmosphere glowed with storms the size of continents. Juno, our pilot, kept her hands calm on the throttle, the way surgeons keep their hands calm on scalpels. Her voice was low, the kind you use when you're trying not to wake sleeping things. "Periapsis in 3 minutes," she said. The HUD readouts cascaded like falling water, delta V windows, thermal loads, thruster cycles. We strapped in until the straps bit into our bones. Heat shields we'd scraped together and patched with field expedients hummed under thermal load. The plan was to dip just into the upper atmosphere, a skim, use aerodynamic braking, kiss the gravity well, and be flung outward with a velocity boost that felt like borrowing momentum from the planet's spin. The run went clean at first. Gas brushed the hull. The outer sensors went screaming in a way that sounds less like noise and more like prayer. We felt the ship's belly brush warm. The hull flexed like muscle working. The autopilot nibbled at corrections. The trajectory held. I thought I had always known how the Marauder moved until the sky decided to teach me otherwise. The first anomaly came as a whisper on the comms, a slight variance in attitude control. Our RCS thrusters, the little jets that point and nudge, began to chatter oddly. A valve had stuck somewhere in the feed system, and fuel sloshed in ways our models did not like. Kade, running engineering from a cramped console, cursed and pushed an override. "Bleed the left tank," he barked. The gauges wavered like a fever chart. For a heartbeat, we thought we had it. Then the sensors flagged thermal ablation upstream. Material from a leading strut, insulation, some of the patches we were proud of and ashamed of had started to fissure under heating. Sparks inside insulation are not a movie thing. In a plasma environment, they bloom into small, extremely hot threads that find the weakest seam and follow it. Our attitude shifted by degrees. The autopilot corrected. That correction burned delta V. The delta V burned our hope. "Offset angle is increasing," Juno said, voice thin. "We're banking out of window." We were banking because the planet threw us 100 ways at once.
The gravity assist is a mathematical handshake. If you miss the timing, the handshake becomes a shove. Instead of giving us velocity in the direction we wanted, the giant planet altered our vector into a slingshot that intersected, by tragic coincidence, the orbit of a distant, slow-moving comet. Comets have very particular orbits, long, loping ellipses with tails that fan like flags when they get close to a star. We had the misfortune of aligning with one on a return leg. The math on the nav console turned into a sentence with a subject and no good predicate. We were on a comet-bound trajectory. Panic is an academic word until you live inside its physics. You don't scream in a cockpit unless you want to lose the room. Instead, we become efficient. Roach, who is not a man you want to be mad at you on a Tuesday, leaned forward and started spitballing solutions like a man laying tracks to cross a chasm. "Manual burn now," he said. "We torque with the aft and vent to compensate." We needed a delta V burn that the Marauder had no business making without a full pre-flight of every system. The main engine was designed for big pushes, not for the kind of controlled, improvised burn that could peel us off a comet arc without frying our propellant lines. Worse, the valve cluster that fed the main was a hot mess of patch jobs. We had two choices that weren't choices: try a risky manual burn and hope our patched lines held, or accept the Comet's custody and drift into a cold orbit that might take us centuries to escape. I volunteered to run the burn sequence because my ego is the size of a kneecap and because somebody had to be the one to touch the red lever. The procedure was a ballet of old-school piloting and prayer. We rotated the ship to present a tiny, calculated cross-section to the Comet's incoming vector, set the main to pulse, and read the telemetry in breaths. For fuel management, we bled inert gas through the low-pressure lines to prevent cavitation. For thermal, we battened the panels and pointed the heat radiators away like shields. Every action was a compromise. At T- burn, we fired. The main woke with a cough and a roar that felt like a living thing remembering its purpose. For a glorious few seconds, it seemed as if physics had forgiven us. Velocity ticked, math aligned, and the arc corrected by fractions that felt like mercy. Then a shudder rolled through the hull like a sob. One of the secondary tanks, a tank we'd jerry-rigged in port, welded in a sweat of desperation, ruptured along a seam we had marked iffy. Fuel leaked into the void, a silent geyser that stole thrust and left the aft in a twist. "Shut it down!" Kade yelled, already reaching to isolate the feed. "Isolate the aft manifold!" We shut down the main in a motion like cutting an engine mid-song. The immediate result was stabilizing and terrifying. We stalled in a precarious sweet spot between being flung and being swallowed. The ship drifted like a wounded animal.
The Comet's gravity held us gently, a cold palm. Its tail trailed dust and ice that shimmered with electrostatic fire when it struck sunlight. The visual was breathtaking, curtains of cometary dust streaming past like ghosts. We were tethered to a fate that wanted us to stay. Now the problem was worse in an insidious way. We were stuck with limited fuel and damaged lines, and the Comet's perihelion, the point of its nearest approach to the star, would change our thermal environment in days. If we could not escape before perihelion, the Comet's activity might increase, spitting gas and debris in patterns that could scupper even the most brilliant plan. Stuck in the Comet's arc, we had two choices: rig an escape using RCS and careful mass ejection, or try to harvest volatile outgassing from the Comet for thrust. The latter smelled like science fiction, the former smelled like cramped math. We chose both. The Marauder has cargo vents and ballast systems that could be repurposed. We started by ejecting non-essential mass, old supplies, broken rigs, a crate of sentimental junk that no one wanted except the one crewman who had long ago died and whose box no one would let go of. Letting go of that crate felt like a funeral. We fed the ejected mass in controlled vectors to create tiny reaction impulses. The idea is Newtonian and charming. Throw something heavy one way and you move the other. It's the kind of trick you see in simulations and not in the real world, where everything shakes and the thing you threw could come back as a problem. Simultaneously, Issa and Kade worked on a wild idea: tap the Comet's outgassing and fashion a crude propellant feed. Cometary jets are a violent physics show. Sunlight heats volatiles, they vaporize, and gas bursts out, carrying dust with it. If you can pipe that gas through a nozzle, you get thrust. It's messy and unpredictable. It required building a makeshift intake out of heat blankets, a series of one-way valves we cannibalized from the habitat, and a directionally controlled exhaust, basically turning part of the cargo bay into a pop gun. It smelled like hot solder and desperation. We waited for the Comet's day side to warm. When the sun caught an icy patch just right, the jet blew. We had minutes to orient our intake and capture the flow. It was like trying to catch a hurricane with a teacup. The first attempt spat frost and shredded a panel. The second attempt produced a steady plume that we could feed into a nozzle. It gave us a gentle, sweet push. 2 weeks later, after baby step burns and mass ejections and constellations of little hacks, we had done enough to change our orbital energy. The nav console stopped telling us in the flippant tones of inevitability and began to whisper the possibility of escape. The Delta V we cobbled together was a fraction of what mission planners would consider sane, but sanity had left the ship. We scaled burns, used the RCS to nudge attitude while feeding the captured Comet gas into a makeshift monoprop nozzle, and timed our maneuvers with the careful obsession of puzzle solvers who know the stakes.
I will not lie. There were moments where the ship felt like a coffin we were trying to slide a lid off of while it was moving across a funeral procession. Pieces we had patched in port creaked, seals hissed, and for a long night we watched the gauge for cabin pressure flirt with red. But the thing about improvisation is that it rewards stubbornness. Our combined small pushes added up. The final burn was theatrical in a way that made no sense until it worked. We used the RCS to present the intake to the Comet's tail at a narrow angle, fed a stream of collected gas into the nozzle, and pulsed the alternator to compensate for power draw. The ship lurched, then sighed, then slid. We felt gravity slacken as our periaxis shifted. The nav screen, which had been a cruelly honest judge for days, blinked and then smiled in the tiny way only numbers can. Escape vector achieved. We did not celebrate like children. Celebration felt like a luxury that would jinx us. Instead, we checked systems, patched the ruptured tank with a welded clamp that looked like a childhood toy and an engineering miracle, and fed the data into a recorder with a shaky hand. We plotted a course that would take us to a depot 3 jumps away, a legal gray market pit stop where we could get proper repairs. The Marauder had earned her reprieve the way a bad dog earns a second chance, by showing she could still carry the pack. When we finally punched the burn to head away from the Comet and toward the depot, the tail fell away like a bad memory. The gas giant, the one we had skimmed like a knife, shrinking behind us, still looked angry and indifferent. I sat back in my harness, hands trembling, and watched the instruments. The crew around me were quiet and hollow and alive. Roach laughed once, a sound that fractured the silence into pieces. Juno smiled in a way that suggested relief and a new respect for the void. Kade kept calculating, already finding the angles for the next business trip. Issa stared at the data like a woman who had just read a book that changed her life. People will tell you the Slingshot was reckless. They will be right. They will also tell you we stole time from a planet and that we came close to paying the ultimate price for it. They will be right about that too. But they will also be missing one truth. Living in space is a ledger where every credit and debit is measured in small margins and human improvisation. We saved that mission with a string of ideas, some math, a fair bit of luck, and a willingness to improvise with our lives balanced on the edge of consequence. If there's a quiet thing I keep from the whole episode, it's the Comet's tail once we cleared it. A slow, shimmering curtain lit by a distant star, beautiful in a way that made your insides ache. We had been trapped by it, almost claimed by it, and then we'd used the Comet against itself to get away. We left with fewer supplies, a patched hull, and a story that tasted of metal and coffee and the kind of tired bravery that does not look for applause.
Later, in the depot bar, someone toasted to the Marauder and to the crew that kept her breathing. I drank and thought about how narrow the margin is between a brilliant maneuver and a funeral pyre. I thought about how, in space, more than anywhere, what separates survival from disaster is often improvisation, the stubborn human talent for making do when the universe would rather you stop trying. We took off our helmets, and one by one we laughed until we cried, because it felt like paying rent to the universe,
and getting change back.